Welcome back. Moving on, our next speaker is Arianna Ornaghi. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Warwick, and her presentation will allow us to move a little bit to a particular important arena for the way democracies work, which is actually the judicial arena. And her research is about how gender attitudes have an influence on the decisions made by these public officials. So without further ado, Arianna, it's a great pleasure to have you among us, and the virtual floor is yours.
Wonderful. So this is great. And first of all, just thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone for taking the time and being here. So the project that I'm going to be talking about today is joint work with Elliot Ash, who's at ETH Zurich, and Daniel Chen, who's at Toulouse. And what we try to do in this paper is to try and understand whether and how gender attitudes of US circuit court judges influence their behavior. Now, before I start, I actually just wanted to give you a very kind of broad overview of what we do here. So the question that we ask is, as I just said, is how gender attitudes influence judicial behavior. And the type of behavior we're particularly interested in studying are interactions with female peers. What we do in the paper is to propose and implement a novel measure of gender attitudes for these judges that is based on use of gender stereotypes in text. And what we find is that Slant predicts interactions with female judges, and in particular, higher slanted judges are more likely to reverse decisions that were originally taken by a female rather than a male district judge. They are less likely to assign opinions to female judges, but they're also less likely to cite opinions that were authored by a female judge. Okay, so now let me tell you a little bit more about the motivation for the project. Now, our kind of big picture motivation to study this research question is that women are underrepresented at the top of the legal profession. In the US, women have been almost 50% of law students for quite a long time now. However, they are still only 36% of the legal profession. And what is interesting is that the closer you get to the top, the larger the gap. In the specific setting that we're going to be focusing on for this project, which are US circuit courts, only 26% of all sitting judges were women in 2019. So the question, kind of a natural question is whether a differential treatment of female judges that is due to the gender attitudes of their colleague can potentially have a role in explaining and contributing to this gap. Now, the challenge to answering this research question is that traditional measures of gender attitudes are simply not available for these judges. So in social sciences, usually there are ways of trying to get a sense of gender attitudes by directly interacting with the subjects, but we just don't have this type of access here. What we have instead, however, are large corpora or written text that is authored by these judges. So what do we do? What we do is to take techniques that have been developed in the natural language processing that are generally aimed at measuring bias in language and apply to these corpus to this large amount of text that we have for the judges. And in particular, the type of text that we're going to be analyzing are the opinions that these judges write to explain, to substantiate their decision in a judicial case. Very broadly, our measure of gender slant is going to be looking at the strength of the association of men with career and women with family in these opinions. So the key technology that is powering our approach are word embeddings models. Word embeddings are low-dimensional vectorial representation of language that importantly preserve semantic meaning. We start with a corpus, we take the vocabulary of the corpus, and each single word when we represent each single word as a vector in a 300-dimensional space. Now, importantly, the position of the vector in the space is determined by an algorithm that predicts the empirical co-occurrence of words in the corpus we're interested in analyzing. Now, effectively, what this means is that the position of word vectors in the space is based really on the context that words are used in. Words that frequently appear in the same context are going to have a similar representation. They're going to be close together in the space. Instead, words that rarely appear in the same context are going to be far apart, and they're going to have quite a different representation. Now, the reason why we chose to use word embeddings is because the word vectors that stem from them are really able to capture semantic relationship between words. They do so in two principal ways. On the one hand, the distance between two vectors is informative about how similar two words are. But in addition to this, word vector differences are also meaningful in this representation. And this is because the relative position of words conveys meaning. So for example, if you look at the small graph that I'm showing on the left-hand side, what you can start seeing is that, for example, the relative position of male and female words is going to be similar for different pair of words. What this means is that by taking the vector difference between male and female words, we can identify a step into the male dimension. And effectively, this gender dimension, if applied to a female word, should get us close to the male equivalent of that word. And kind of just as an intuition, this is why word embeddings do so well in solving analogy tasks. It's because of this relative positioning of words being meaningful. Okay, so how do we use this to get to our gender slant measure? Well, first of all, as I said, we're interested in gender. So we simply identify this gender dimension by taking the difference between average vectors for representative male and female words. And we identify this kind of step in the male direction. In addition to this, we are interested in the stereotypical connotation of this dimension in the corpus being represented. And so we also identify a stereotypical dimension, which is simply the difference between words for career and words with family. Then we define gender slant to be the cosine similarity between the two dimensions. If the two dimensions point very much in the same direction, then the cosine similarity is going to be close to 1. We then say that the corpus represents a high gender slant. If they're kind of at the 90-degree angle, then they're really not related. So we're going to have a cosine similarity of 0. And then at the extreme, if they're pointing in opposite direction, we're going to have a cosine similarity equal to 1, which is a very low gender slant. But just to give you an idea, we never really see gender slant that is below 0. And the intuition for the gender slant measure is that if the relative position of male and female words is very similar to that of career and family words, then the concepts are going to be highly related in the corpus. Okay, so very broadly, this is a machinery that can be applied to different corpora. So how do we go from this to having a judge-specific gender slant measure? Very simply, we take all the opinions that are authored by a judge, we consider it a separate corpus, and then we train an embeddings model for each judge using GLOVE, which is just a standard algorithm to train word embeddings models. Now, this is all well and good, but there's an additional challenge here. And that is that word embeddings function best when they are trained on large corpora. We do a couple of things to take it into account. First of all, we use a bootstrap approach, which was suggested by Antoinak and Mirmo, in which we take 25 bootstrap samples of the corpus and we train different embeddings for each of these bootstrap samples. We get a gender slant measure for each of them, and then our gender slant measure for the judge is going to be simply the median across these different samples. And what this buys us is that there is some stability. And in particular, there's not going to be any single document that is pushing our gender slant measure in a given direction. In addition to this, we also restrict the sample to judges that have a sufficiently large corpus. And by sufficiently large, we basically try to do kind of an empirical predictive exercise, and that kind of ensures that our gender dimension is conveying meaning. We basically try to predict first names, male and female first names based on the cosine similarity between these first names and the gender dimension, and we find that we do quite well as long as the corpus has at least 1.5 million tokens. And so we have these 139 judges that are going to be our sample. Great. So let me first tell you a little bit about kind of descriptively how does this gender slant measure look like. What I'm showing in this graph is the probability distribution function of the gender slant measure that we have. And what you can see is that really most judges do display a stereotypical association between men and career and women with family in their language, but they differ quite a bit in how strong the association is. And we're gonna be estimating the effect of gender slant by comparing judges with different level of slant, exactly. Also very descriptively, we see that female and younger judges tend to display lower slant, but limited differences across other demographic characteristics. Great. So what do we do? So how do we use this gender slant measure? As I said before, remember we are interested in understanding how slant impacts the behavior of these judges. But what we really want to be able to say something about kind of a causal effect of slant. So how do we do this? Well, our empirical strategy is really exploiting two key features. First of all, in this setting, we have quasi-random assignment of judges to cases within a circuit and a year. What this means is that there is no self-selection of judges to a specific case based on the expected outcome, and therefore cases assigned to higher and lower slanted judges are comparable. Now, in addition to this, we really want to be able, however, to say something about the effect of slant, and to isolate it, we also just condition on detailed observable characteristics that we have for these judges. We use kind of a slightly different design and specification depending on the specific outcome, but I'm not really going to go into details for this presentation. So before I get to actually the results that I really want to talk to you about, I just want to briefly mention that we do try to validate the measure. And in particular, the way in which we do this is that we check whether gender slant is predictive of behavior in a situation where we would expect it to do so if slant is indeed proxying for some gender attitudes. And these are decisions in gender-related cases. And what we find is that slanted judges vote more conservatively in gender-related cases. There are cases about sexual harassment, reproductive rights, and gender discrimination. So we think that this shows that indeed kind of our gender slant measure is picking up something that has to do with gender attitude. So now we can finally get back to our kind of, the main question of interest, and then it is just, so how do gender attitudes influence interactions with female judges? Okay, so what are the, before I actually show you the results, what are the interactions that we can look at? So what is interesting in this setting is that we have detailed metadata for all the cases that are decided by these US circuit judges. And so we can infer some interactions based on what we see in the data. We look at three types of interactions. We look at reversal of district court decisions that were originally taken by a female or a male district judge. We look at the assignment of opinions to female or male of male circuit judges, and then we look at citations of opinion that were authored by a male or a female judge. Now, to understand this a little bit better, let me tell you just for a brief moment a little bit more about the context. So what we're studying here are US circuit courts. They are the intermediate level of the federal justice system, and they review decisions of district courts that are the lower level for errors of law. At the district level, cases are decided by a single quasi-randomly assigned judge who's going to be a woman or a man. If the case is appealed, it goes up to the circuit level. At the circuit level, cases are assigned to a panel of 3 judges, well, quasi-randomly assigned to a panel of 3 judges. And once a decision is reached by the panel, then the most senior judge on the panel assigns the opinion writing to one of these judges. Once the judge is going to be writing their opinion, they're going to be citing previous decisions to, again, substantiate the decision that they take. And so you can see how we get these interactions starting from the context. So what do we see? Well, the first result is that slanted judges are more likely to reverse female district judges rather than male district judges. In addition to this, when slanted judges are the most senior judge on the panel, they are less likely to assign the opinion to a female judge. And finally, we also find that when they're writing the opinion, slanted judges are less likely to cite opinions which were originally authored by a female judge. Now, before I conclude, I just want to spend a second telling you that, we really try to do a little bit more to try and understand whether our slant measure is really picking up gender preferences or something else. And what we do here is that we do a couple of things here. So the first thing that we do is we check whether slanted judges differentially respond to other judge characteristics, and we find that that is not the case. We also check whether gender slant explains voting in non-gender related cases. And we do find some evidence that yes, it does, but the effect is much smaller than in gender related cases, which I think is consistent with the idea of gender really mattering for gender slant. And right, and generally all our analysis is also robust to just controlling for conservativeness more directly. Okay, so just very briefly, I know I'm out of time. In this project, we propose and implement kind of a text-based measure of gender attitudes for U.S. Circuit Court judges, and we find that gender attitudes influence interaction with female judges, which we think is an important result because some of these dimensions are likely going to be career relevant for these judges, which kind of gets us back to the gender gap in kind of the judicial system, which was our initial starting point. And that's it. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arianna, for this presentation that allowed us to start digging deeper a little bit on text analysis, the topic that will also occupy the next few presentations. So that was a very interesting presentation. My first question would be, you are looking at how gender attitudes affect a certain type of outcomes, but these outcomes are outcomes in relation to other judicial actors. The first thing that came to my mind is to what extent this has an influence on parties, for instance, on those that are the parties to the case. If a female is a party to the case, could we actually see these kind of effects on the parties of the case beyond what is happening already at the within the judicial system?
Now, this is an excellent question, and I think it's it's absolutely a good point and something we would like to explore. So in the specific setting we are looking here with circuit courts, we try to think whether we could do something like that. It's a bit unclear. We tried to see in how many cases we could actually assign a gender to one of the party, and it turned out to be a little bit more of a difficult problem. But what we can do is that something we were working on and we're thinking about is at the lower level, so at the district court level, there are sentencing decisions for criminal cases. And in that case, most of the defendants are going to be individuals, and we can get a gender for them. So that's something, so we think in a different setting, that's something we are definitely interested in understanding, because you could think that, if gender attitudes, if what we're seeing is really proxying for gender attitudes, then you could imagine them kind of affecting behavior along many dimensions. So here we look at a little bit of voting, we look at interactions with colleagues, but for sure there could be something going on also with the parties in the trial. And I mean, there's a separate interesting paper that looks at that. So for example, that looks at using a very different approach, but they look, for example, at hiring. So, if you're exposed to a female judge, are you more or less likely to then hire a female clerk? And so you can see this gender gap kind of in the judicial labor market, quote unquote, kind of, having a broader effects for recruiting and down the line.
Interesting. So I have a question from Matthias. Did you see changes also over time by the same judges? So you had, I think, 139 judges over quite a period of time. Do you observe changes throughout this period?
So this is a great question, again, and something that we think it's very interesting to study, because in a way, what we're doing in this paper is we are saying, we have this kind of static measure of gender attitudes, how that impacts behavior. But I think kind of the next immediate question is really, what are the determinants of these gender attitudes? And so having this type of time varying measure, I think, would be really necessary to answer these kind of more, perhaps even more important and more interesting questions. So right now, the methodology that we are using that doesn't really work for this type of time varying measures. And this is because we really need a large corpora, and already doing it at the judge level, we are kind of pushing it. But we really hope that there are kind of different methodologies that can be used, that we're thinking about, kind of that have been developed by natural language processing, people working in this area for kind of smaller snippets of text. And this is something we are considering of working on, because we do think it would be super interesting to look at. So hopefully we'll get a chance to do that in the future.
Just a last question. I really like the way that you validated your measure with these specific cases on gender-related issues. So to what extent do you take into consideration that you are analyzing cases from different law areas, right? So there might be there also some kind of effect that could be driving your results. Have you taken that into consideration? How do you take into consideration the different policy areas or legal areas into your model? How is that considered?
So no, that's another excellent point. We kind of don't. So for most of the analysis on the interactions, we can control for legal area, and we still find the same effect. Something that is interesting, for example, in opinion assignment, is that we don't. You could think that there may be different marginal effects depending on the type of case that is being analyzed. So maybe one story that economists have in mind is that perhaps women, when they're working in a team, they get assigned more kind of work that is not that important. So we wanted to try and get a proxy for that. We don't see, based on the data that we have, we don't see much along that dimension. But it's definitely something that we like to explore more. And then in general, another kind of concern is that, you might be a little bit worried that when we are looking at decisions, we are kind of, using kind of something that is trained on the decision himself to predict the decision. And there we check just by dropping these kind of gender-related cases that are kind of few and far apart, because they tend to be very specific. We still have the same results.
Okay, thank you very much, Arianna, for sharing with us the economist point of view into this discussion, and for also shedding some light on the courts, on how they work. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye.